The date is January 8th, 1942. In the bitter winter cold just northwest of Moscow, the frozen battlefields around Rzhev and Vyazma stretch under a heavy sky. The snow is deep, the wind merciless, and the German lines form a massive bulge into Soviet territory. This salient, held by Wehrmacht forces of Army Group Center, threatens the capital, a deadly thorn digging into the Soviet defenses. The Soviets know that unless they strike here, the Germans might regroup and launch new offensives toward Moscow. At the highest levels of command in Moscow, the message is clear. The winter counteroffensive must not stop. Joseph Stalin orders a broad, relentless strike. Soviet forces on the Kalinin Front to the north and the Western Front to the west begin mobilizing for a massive counterattack, pressing to collapse the salient and push the German armies backward, deprive them of their hold, and relieve pressure on the capital. Despite the brutal cold, temperatures plunging well below freezing, heavy snowdrifts blanketing roads and forests, the Soviet armies prepare. The terrain is treacherous, frozen rivers, marshlands hidden beneath snow, dense forest that hinders large armored formations and slows movement. Vehicles struggle across icy roads. Supply trucks get stuck in half-frozen mud when the thaw begins. Visibility is limited by blizzards and low light. Every advance is hard-fought. On January 10th, the counter-offensive kicks off. The Kalinin Front strikes from the north, using both infantry armies and cavalry corps to press west of Rzhev, aiming to cut off German forces from their northern lifelines. Meanwhile, the Western Front, reinforced by rifle armies and mechanized forces, attacks along multiple axes toward Vyazma, aiming to sever German rail lines and junctions that feed the front lines. The aim is ambitious: to encircle German forces, isolate them in the salient, and destroy or force their retreat. At first, the Soviets make gains. Cavalry units exploit gaps in the defenses, infantry infiltrates frozen forests, and artillery pounds German positions relentlessly. The German Ninth Army and supporting corps are stretched thin, forced to guard a wide front line. Soviet offensive thrusts push forward dozens of kilometers in places, forcing the Germans to shorten their lines. Some German units are cut off or isolated behind improvised Soviet breakthroughs. But the Germans are not idle. Field commanders such as Walter Model gather reserves, moving divisions into threatened sectors. Reinforcements arrive, defenses are reinforced, and the Germans systematically plug gaps. In northern sectors, cold and snow slow mechanized support. In southern sectors, heavy rail-based logistics help Germans reinforce more quickly. The Wehrmacht uses well-prepared defensive lines around the salient, and anti-tank defenses and artillery crews hold firm. Throughout January and February, the fighting becomes attritional. Soviet armies press again and again, but each push meets stiff resistance, reinforced defenses, and logistical bottlenecks. The winter weather exacts a heavy toll on men, weapons, and supply chains. Tanks struggle across frozen marshes. Infantry must slog through snow and forest. Supply columns are delayed by poor roads hidden under snow and mud. Meanwhile, Soviet airborne operations attempt to complement the offensive. Paratroopers are dropped behind German lines near Vyazma and other key points in hopes of disrupting logistics and creating encirclements. But the airborne operations suffer heavy losses. Many parachute troops fail to reach their assembly points, and resistance is fierce. The drops help tie down German troops, but do not achieve the necessary breakthroughs. By spring, the Soviet offensive has slowed. The Germans have reinforced the Rzhev salient with fresh divisions, armored units, defensive fortifications, and improved supply lines. The salient remains one of the most heavily defended and strategically critical positions on the Eastern Front. The attacks have imposed casualties on the Germans, forced them to divert units from other sectors, and disrupted their logistics, but have not succeeded in destroying or fully encircling them. Casualties on the Soviet side are staggering. Losses in personnel are heavy, with rifle divisions and mechanized units suffering through constant frontal assaults, deep snow, and entrenched enemy positions. Tanks are lost to anti-tank guns hidden in forests. Infantry suffers frostbite and exhaustion, and artillery becomes ineffective due to frozen ground that affects cratering or gun placement. German reports indicate that their Ninth Army and supporting formations are under serious pressure, but still able to hold. Yet, the offensive is far from forgotten. Soviet leadership sees this counteroffensive as a crucial part of their larger winter campaign. The idea is not only to defend Moscow, but to shift to the offensive, to force the enemy to expend reserves, to weaken Army Group Center, and prepare the ground for future operations. The salient near Rzhev and Vyazma is not just a battlefield, but a choke point on supply lines to the capital. By keeping up pressure, the Soviets hope to degrade the German force over months, forcing them to allocate resources away from other fronts. In July and August 1942, a renewed offensive is launched. The Soviet Kalinin Front in the north and the Western Front in the south coordinate large thrusts, now using deception operations, maskirovka. They simulate troop concentrations elsewhere, create dummy units, fake radio traffic, and decoy supply flows to mislead the Germans about the point of attack. This deception draws German reserves away from the main assault sectors near Rzhev and Vyazma. When the real offensive begins on August 4, 1942, Soviet armies push hard. Mechanized formations, rifle armies, and artillery concentrate on narrow breakthrough sectors. Tanks, supported by infantry and ski troops, attempt to break through German defensive belts, aiming to encircle or cut off the salient from rail junctions and supply routes. At the same time, dummy deployments and deception forces mislead the Germans into believing major attacks are targeted further south, causing them to commit armored units away from the main thrust. In the first days of August, the Soviets achieve surprising advances. Some units push 40-kilometer penetrations in 2 days, exploiting surprise and broken winter defenses. The Germans are forced to move panzer divisions from other sectors to plug the breach. Their intelligence had been fooled. German forces reacted to phantom concentrations. The offensive threatens railway lines and supply corridors, feeding the salient, causing German logistical strain and raising fears that the salient may be cut off entirely. But as quickly as the gains are made, the offensive loses momentum. The Germans reinforce with reserves, including armored corps and motorized infantry divisions. Counterattacks hit the Soviet flanks. Muddy roads from the thaw slow supply. Tanks get bogged down in melting snow and muddy terrain. Artillery ammunition is delayed. The narrow thrust sectors become clogged. Soviet units lose momentum. The fighting remains brutal, high casualty, attritional warfare. Soviet commanders attempt to exploit breakthroughs, but supply and weather hamper further advances. The German defenders systematic reinforce and shorten their lines. The salient remains intact, but the cost to the Germans is high as well. Divisions are weakened, reserves drained, and forces forced to hold under enormous strain. Although the offensive did not result in the total collapse of the salient or full encirclement, it achieved strategic value. It tied down German units, forced reallocations, and drained Army Group Center of reserves that could have been used elsewhere. The Red Army learned lessons in winter operations, coordination, mechanized assaults in difficult terrain, and deception. The salients remained contested, but the Germans paid dearly for their defensive success. In subsequent operations, such as the later Operation Mars, November to December 1942, the Germans faced cumulative attrition from these earlier counteroffensives. The toll on infantry, armor, and supply lines from months of pressure contributed to weakening German ability to reinforce the southern fronts later. Yet in the grand narrative of World War II, this 1942 counteroffensive becomes overshadowed by events like Stalingrad or Kursk. Few textbooks highlight the months of grinding, high-casualty fighting around Rzhev and Vyazma, but historians today call it the Rzhev Meat Grinder, a testament to the horror, resilience, and sacrifice that shaped the Eastern Front. For the soldiers on both sides, the winter 1942 operations were not about glory. They were about survival. Through frozen forests and muddy roads, the rifle divisions advanced. Ski troops infiltrated the forests, cavalry units glided through snow, and artillery rained shells into German bunkers. Each meter gained was paid for in human lives. Today, remote villages around Rzhev echo with stories of ghosts, ruins of trenches, frozen artillery pieces hidden in forest glades, old rail lines buried by snow and time. The men who fought there remain largely unnamed in popular memory. Yet their sacrifice shaped the broader course of the war, draining German strength and buying time for the Soviet Union to recover. In the end, the 1942 counteroffensive around Rzhev and Vyazma was more than a failed or partial breakthrough. It was a crucible. It forged new operational doctrines in harsh winter conditions, tested ideas of massed artillery, cavalry, airborne operations behind enemy lines, and complex deception. It wore down the Germans bit by bit and laid groundwork for later, larger offensives that would push the Wehrmacht back. As we remember the great turning points of the war, let us not forget the frozen forests, the silent snowfields, and the nameless riflemen who fought through winter's cruelty. The battles of Rzhev-Vyazma in 1942 remain a forgotten counteroffensive, but one whose echoes continue to shape the story of World War II.